Thanks so much for having me, everyone. As Jason said, I'm talking about a little bit different of a topic, but a continuation of what just Patrick said, talking about what is it that the consumers of the evidence, let it be regulators, clinicians, more specifically patients, want to know, and how as a community can we help do that. So just to give you an overview, I just want to give you a little bit of like sort of idea of like how did it start, where are we now. We heard a lot about Patrick. I am doing my best not to repeat that. And then think about like as a larger community who is vested or has vested interest in observational and research, what are we actually doing now? What are some of the missing things, like some of the gaps, and are there impediments? How can we think throughout this day in terms of like the next steps, our contributions as a community to the big mission? We're all here to improve health. So we heard a lot about Patrick, about what we've done. So I'm really hoping that I can build on the top of that. But I also want to be a little bit provocative and talk about the elephant in the room. The idea is that for all of us to think about what is it that we're doing and how can we do more. So let's do it together. For those of you who are not new, you probably have seen this slide, at least in one training, if not more. This is how it all started. After the FDA Amendment Act, calling for a risk identification analysis system. That was back in 2007. And in response to that, the OMA, or Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership, was put together. Fast forward, we're sitting here in 2023, and as Patrick just showed, we have built a community, an open source community. We have over 3,000 collaborators and databases. We know methodology, and we're building standards to allow us to generate evidence at scale. This is a huge improvement, and we've been doing a lot of it as, again, Patrick showed. I promise this is the last one. We have done a lot. Just look at the number of publications here from 2010 to like a huge increase in the number of publications per year, and an increase, a tremendous amount of citations, over 12,000 citations. We have a lot of educational content, YouTube, and also Eden Academy. And most importantly, we're seeing more everyday new collaborators and newcomers who are joining the effort. So we have an army. We have a huge, a lot of tools in our backpack, so we can to build, right? So when I looked at that, and when I got, when we discussed the topic about what I'm going to talk, I had a question. We have over 580 publications. Let's see what they've done. Odyssey dashboard, you can actually pull these publications. I did a quick assessment of what is it that we're publishing. So looking at that, like this is a huge amount of work that you guys have all done in the community to put the infrastructure and standards together and provide and work on different methodologies that can enable us to answer a lot of questions. When it comes to clinical studies, we're doing around like 50-something characterizations, some population level estimation, looking at the impact of drugs on specific outcomes, and patient level prediction. And doing a little bit more going into that characterizations, we see a lot, like a good amount of characterization that happened during COVID, and a tiny amount that are disease specific, natural history of the disease or the epidemiology of the disease, and mostly on characterizations of the drug use. And when we're looking at our population level estimation, we do a lot of safety of medications, specifically in common diseases, hypertension, diabetes, and COVID. And we've been able to contribute a lot. And I asked myself a question, what is the community in large doing? Similar exercise, I did it a little bit back, around like 7, I think, or 10,000 publications from PubMed. This is a list, and this is generally, I did a sort of categorization, but a combination of drugs and diseases that are being studied in observational research. If So you start from the beginning, you see a lot of warfarin and DOACs and atrial fibrillation, and then diabetes. So basically, the community in large is pretty much the same. Fairly a narrower focus on mostly blockbuster prescription drugs and common chronic diseases. There might be a lot of reasons for that. We have data at large, and they're important. A lot of people are using it. There is a need to do that, right? But one question is, what else is there and what can we do? So the way I think about it is that it actually reminds me of a Rumpelstiltskin story. We've been creating a lot of gold. We see that like the methodology is there, the system is there, and it is about time that we should start creating more evidence. We have to use it to be able to do it at large. So what is it that we have to do? How should we use this gold? So this is pretty much where we are today, right? It doesn't mean that we're not doing anything else. It means that that's what we've done, that's what we're building, and we're pretty much good at it. We do a lot of comparative safety and effectiveness of common diseases, mostly addressing a specific question when it comes to drug safety and pharmacovigilance. Question is that what are the end users want, right? The people, what are the other segments? So we're all here to improve health. We're all here for patients. There are other segments. So the question is, what does patient want, right? As a patient, what do we want to hear? I want to know, what drug should I use? What is my long-term outcome? How am I going to respond? What's going to be the quality of my life? A regulator has a responsibility to approve this drug. They need to know the safety and effectiveness of the drug. That comes with certain needs. The HTA agencies, health technology agencies, wants to know the relative effectiveness of these drugs, whether it's patient-centric, is it cost effectiveness, is it safe or effective? Pharmaceutical companies are developing this drug, so they go from an early phase discovery to late phase clinical development and clinical trials, to submission to regulators and HTAs, and then launching the drug and then looking into like how the drug is working in the life cycle, like in real world. The insurance have to provide access to the patients, and clinician has an important decision to make. What should I prescribe to my patients? So all of these segments have a lot of different questions, right? So we need to address these needs. So a part of our job is to think about what are each of these stakeholders need, how can we communicate with them, how can we hear from their needs to start thinking about research questions, and then how to communicate back. So, but what do they actually need, right? So that's a good question. So I did a relatively non-scientific assessment of the potential needs. It's relative because a part of it I got from what's currently available in the literature and publications, to look at like what regulators and HTA agencies are already looking at when it comes to observational data and where can we play. This is what you see, the color-coded, like supposed to be a heat map, is the specific areas that have been mostly used, like the more you go to the blue, see a lot of safety and effectiveness that's being used, disease epidemiology, and when it comes to HTAs, there's a lot of focus on quality of life, resource use, cost, and long-term effectiveness. I called up a bunch of my friends, clinician friends, and also I interviewed some clinicians at MedInfo to see what they want. Also talked to a couple of people who are involved in patient groups to get an understanding. It's definitely not scientific, maybe not reproducible, I hope it is, but this is what I got, right? Similar type of evidence. We want to know whether the drug is safe. It's very important to see whether it works. What's our quality of life? What's the long-term effectiveness? So this is the picture that you see, and that sort of indicates in terms of like the other use case or the other areas that we should think about as a community. So put another axis here and that. And the third one is that, are we doing enough in terms of addressing specific diseases, right? So If you remember the publication that I showed you, and specifically what the community at large is doing, it's mostly hypertension and diabetes and common diseases. What else is there? So this is just a snapshot of what has been sort of like approved or has been submitted for approval per therapeutic area, an FDA and EMA from the last couple of years, a little bit outdated, but if you look at it, the majority of these are focused on oncology drugs, infectious disease, neuroscience, and then you go down to like allergy and everything else. That's pretty much the same picture everywhere, and I'm sure like if I were to update it, it would be the same. Might be a little bit changed here and there, but that means that we also have to expand with the notion that oncology seems to, for example, be big. I'm going to talk about oncology because I like it. Everyone knows. But when it comes to specific diseases and specific cancer, it becomes very, very small, right? So that creates like issues and limitations, but there is the need. That's the need. There are a lot of patients for that. So the other axis, therapeutic area, that's the other part that we have to think about it. So in summary, if you want to think about like what is it that we need to do, I think as a community, we need to expand our focus. We need to think about the other segments or potential users, the other use cases, and also more therapeutic areas that we can start working on. So what does that mean for us? We're sitting here because we're interested. We're either newcomers who want to contribute, or we've been here in the journey. I think for all of us, it's a good time to start thinking about what is it that I can do to be a part of this journey. If I'm a patient, how can I make sure that this is like, or what are the specific needs to ensure that the patient voices are heard, clinicians the same, regulators and everyone else? How can we actually enable that bridge from the needs to what we're trying to provide? What are the impediments that we can fix? We have a lot of things like already available to do that in terms of the toolkits, data, approaches, but are there any other impediments? Is there specific data issues or lack? Is there specific methods that needs to be addressed? And how as an individual in a community we can work together, look around each other and find people with the same interest to form groups and work on it. And basically do more. So when I think about it, we have created an amazing train tracks. This is what we have at Odyssey right now. We're running one train at a time. I think it's about time to start thinking about how we can add more trains and how we can actually do it more. So this is pretty much like when I thought like I should potentially stop my talk, but as I was doing this, because I thought about it a little bit more about what is it that I want to do. Right? A lot of you probably know I do a lot of oncology work, and I'm very passionate about it. But a little bit broader, sort of like going back and thinking about like all these other needs and other things. Like if I want to get out of here today and think about the next step, what would that mean for me? So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it, and I hope it resonates with some of you and we can form collaboration and work together in that. So as someone who has a lot of interest in oncology, one of the limitations that we see very specifically with oncology, which is not necessarily limited to oncology, is mortality. It's the ultimate endpoint of patient care for a lot of the diseases that we work in terms of describing outcomes. We need that. Patients want to know about like their long-term, their life expectancy. Clinicians a lot of times make decisions based on life expectancy. There's a lot of interest about like whether am I gonna survive the survivorship program. But as a community, and it's not our problem, we have limited information on death. It's a data problem, and but there is a need. I would really like to see how we can work together as a community to address this gap. We have this information, and as I was reviewing those papers, I saw a lot of amazing work that has already been done in terms of how can we pretty much augmented data? What are some methods that we can use to answer these questions? So there's still something that is there that we can build on the top of it. But I think it's a good next step, and one of the things that I can contribute, we together to contribute to be able to answer the mortality, long-term effectiveness, quality of life, and life expectancy. Use it for disease burden, a very, very common question that we get these days from regulators, specifically in EMA, and also health technology assessment. And with that, it means that we need to create relevant mortality data. Where does it come from? That's a challenge to tackle, and build methodologies together to address the use cases, right? How am I going to project? What's the best way to do it at scale using different databases? So I'm going to stop here, and I hope we can today form some collaboration, maybe work on some of these together. And at the end of the day, I hope we can get out of it with new ideas and new ways to collaborate. Thank you so much for having me. Should I ask a question? Who's from Sweden? No, Switzerland. Yes. Hey, hi.
Oh, okay. Hi, thank you very much to both of you for great presentations. It's truly impressive body of work. My name's Jodie. I work with Nicole. Promise I won't say anything to embarrass you, Nicole. My question is around the challenges with innovative therapy and what HTA face with innovative therapy. And you did mention in your talk how with oncology, when you get down to the actual diagnosis, you get smaller and smaller groups. And obviously this is a challenge with innovative therapies such as cell and gene therapy. So my question is, how can Odyssey help HTA deal with uncertainty around small patient groups and, in oncology, but also in other innovative therapies?
That's actually a very good question. So just as a teaser, there will be another talk in the afternoon very specifically focused on oncology. But a lot of the efforts that we've been doing in the community and on oncology, which is not necessarily oncology specific, but that was the use case that can be expanded to others, is how can we actually answer the needs when it comes to specific small population? How can we use the power of network to learn more from bigger chunk of patients across the world, more generalizable type of patients? And this is something that we've been working for the past couple of years. We're going to give you a little bit of teaser, how we're doing. And as you said, for HTA, a very, very good use case is that we're working currently with NICE on the same type of questions. How can we look into the prevalence and survival and long-term survival and project survival for specific cancer types? What does that mean when we get to smaller size? So happy to chat more also about that, but that question comes up very, very often. I think if we can do it, if there is a place that this can be done, this is Odyssey, because of the community and the network.
Hi, thanks. Good morning. And my name is Morning, by the way. Yes. Yeah. Thanks a lot for the talk. Really, really exciting, and then to hear the multiple calls for collaboration. We are part of the Odyssey community because we do look for collaboration a lot as well. So would you able to share some examples on the formats, on exactly how multiple institutes come together in these collaborations? Is it just aiming for publications, or is there a even longer term collaboration that we can develop something, like I say, with longer visions, maybe some joint programs across institutes? I would like to hear more from that, yeah.
Do you want to also join me?
That's the strategy, right?
I mean, I would really love to hear Patrick's point on that, but it can be both, right? So from my experience, since a lot of the work that we do, a lot of times, so COVID was a great example, right? There's a huge question at hand. There's a lot of need. and there is an interest in people who want to contribute. So you get together, you develop like some collaboration, smaller group, bigger group. Some of them will become a long-term friendship and collaboration because you get to know each other and you get to know the capabilities and how you work together and you have shared interests, right? We also have longer term collaboration type that like develop like a path, like and one of the examples like Patrick showed some of these, like for example, like with what's happening, for example, with Darwin, there's a 5-year program. It's a multiple consortium, like sort of like groups of different entities within Odyssey are working together to answer these questions. It's a community thing. There are also programs, and like what we do at Northeastern is to sponsor and foster these kind of long-term collaboration that can help like actually like have like, so like I'm losing the words. Sometimes my English is very bad. To promote educational material and like to ensure that like the new generation of researchers are are able to do the work at quality, generate funding and support funding in the collaboration with the other entities. And a lot of times it can be like to share the interest, like disease, methodology, approach, like open source framework and everything. But basically, what I see as my experience is that you can define it the way you want in the community, and you find people in the community who will join you to help with that.
Thanks, Graham Hart from Melbourne, and I'm a newbie, so forgive me if this is common knowledge already. One of the challenges we have in Australia particularly is patients going from one institution to another. We may have referral patterns from primary care, secondary care, up to tertiary hospitals. We may have people living in an area where they can go to both hospitals, depending on how long the ED queue is in either one. So when we're looking at longer term outcome studies, so for example, in some of the health technology assessments, pelvic mesh, breast implants, those sorts of things which have got a long lead time, how do we identify the primary event and relate that to complications which may occur in a different institution, which may or may not be reporting into Odyssey, which may be, and even if they do, because they're different people to Odyssey, how does that work?
That's a very good question. So I don't think this is necessarily an Australian problem. We see it a lot of times. Like with example is that I got COVID vaccine 7 times, and each of the institutions or medical institutions that I got the vaccine didn't know that I had the vaccine. So I'm basically 7 person. I live in New York City, and I do not have like any records of myself. So it is correct that the health system is fragmented. Like within the US, there are efforts to try to combine them. So now, like for example, I can find some information about my past when I used to live in Baltimore, but that's a problem. So and I heard, I don't have necessarily an answer like how to fix that, but of a lot of time. But this is the data that we're dealing with, right? So when it comes to research, we're trying to ensure that like we at least look at that span of like patient's journey within the data that we can actually comfortably talk about, not make intuition about like what's happening. So for example, when we try to identify a disease, we make sure that the disease happens during the observation, the time that we can observe the patients in the population. So we develop phenotypes accordingly. We develop methodologies to answer these questions, and then there are generalizability discussions of like to what extent do we feel that is generalizable to all patients that are not represented, or to specific like, or the patients that I cannot and capture them entirely in my database that we try to address. We talk about it, and but I think one of the biggest and important part is that we're honest about the data that we have, and we take advantage of it, and we use the right methodology to answer it. But a data fixing a linkage problem and getting that, like, I don't have an answer for that.
So is it possible for, and I haven't thought this through at all, but is it possible for a statistical linkage key to be created in the common data set that enables questions to be answered? Is this the same person? Like, is this population the same? Do they have overlaps? You could still do that in a kind of an aggregated, de-identified reporting structure, but if you had the core data, maybe it would be possible to do something like that.
That's something that we can think about. But the other thing that is happening that's like I see quite a lot in the oncology specific is that there is an understanding then one database cannot give us all. So national, they're like at the national level or state level, depending on where it is, there are efforts to link this data that can actually like make the data more comprehensive, get a better picture. So that's a side in terms of the methodology that can be an approach to think about as a community. We have a lot of great methodologists sitting here, so we can all talk about it together.
Fine projection. My name is Christine and I'm from the University of Melbourne and I work with Dougie Boyle and Roger Ward. See, I've got good projection. I don't need it. Hello. And what I'm interested in is new and emerging unapproved therapeutics and the pharmacovigilance of those, for example, psychedelics and medicinal cannabis. Can you please tell me how we can use our community to monitor these therapeutics?
So I just tell you this, it's actually something I was thinking about like probably a couple months back because of the emergence of psychedelics and their potential approval very, very soon. We don't know how they work, right? So there's, and I was thinking, oh, it would be actually really cool to start looking at it and then like at a population level and try to understand, are they really like safe? Like what are patient getting? The data that we have at the moment are, we see the things that happen that are recorded. At the moment, psychedelics are not recorded for any, like for the total like patients, right? There are specific clinics that are using it. Maybe at some point that becomes available. But I think it's always important to think proactively. Can we think about like how we're going to build that structure? What are the questions that are important? So we start building those pieces. Once the data starts coming up, trying to figure out the way that like, oh, like how should we define it? Like, what does that mean? So we're ready to answer these questions at like a faster rate and like much larger scale. But it's a very good question. I keep thinking about it.
Like mine. But like there is a lot of use of medicinal cannabis globally for a panacea, like multiple conditions. That is an important area for us as a community to work on. So come and see me if you want to join my journey.
Love that.
Jim, also from Melbourne. Again, maybe a naive question. Are there precedents in Odyssey for prospective repeated cycle analyses, for example, in prospective pharmacovigilance or effectiveness?
I agree with you.
That's a good question, Jim. And actually, for much more detailing, I'll refer you to Mark. But one of the collaborations that we have with the US FDA is specifically around how do we do sequential safety monitoring, particularly for vaccines. And there's a wide array of methodologic questions. It's really actually at the heart of what we've been focused on. So as a broader framework, when we talk about safety surveillance, we're really asking the question, does exposure to some intervention cause some sort of outcome? When we saw the, as introduction of any product, whether it be medicinal cannabis or psychedelics or COVID vaccines or some combination cocktail in between, in any of those cases, as exposures are accumulating, there's high uncertainty about what the actual effects are. And so there's a desire to be able to continuously monitor as data accumulates. That introduces some really interesting statistical challenges, which is if you keep looking at the data over and over again, eventually you're going to find something. multiply that by, if you keep looking for a large panel of outcomes, you're eventually going to see something just due to multiplicity and chance alone. So we have now, I don't even know, for like 3 or 4 years into our collaboration with the FDA, specifically trying to evaluate current methods that are used for rapid cycle analysis. There's a framework that's specifically used in the US. It's called maximized sequential probability ratio testing. And Mark and his team have actually been pioneering new methods that are Bayesian frameworks that incorporate empirical calibration. So you can actually incorporate not just multiplicity adjustment, but also the systematic error that exists through those methods. The unfortunate part about most of the safety surveillance work that's being done today is we're using very crude methods for estimating a causal effect and then just doing some little statistical adjustment on top. Our basic premise that we've been trying to advocate in the Odyssey community is if we can do advanced analytics that can be demonstrated to reduce systematic error, confounding, measurement error, selection bias, then why don't we actually apply advanced analytics in the framework of sequential looking so that we can actually try to identify issues as quickly as possible, but also minimize the number of false positive findings that, unfortunately, many of these systems are prone to generate.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Usman, and I'm also part of the Odyssey community and Taiwan Odyssey chapter. Just a comment, it's not really a question, because someone just made a comment that how it's going to have an impact, a global community impact. So because I was involved in the several studies, and I will just want to share one example that how it's, we have done the multinational studies. So we usually try to do the same question to run on the multiple database to see that what are the practices for example, for antibiotics drugs in the pediatric settings. So how the Japan or Taiwan or Korea and other settings or Australia, what are the trends exactly for the prescribing behavior? So we identified that, there are some settings which are close to each other. They have the similar patterns, but some of the states, they have the different. So this really actually gave us an idea that how usually the practices around the globe are working. And also we have done some studies, for example, benzodiazepines on the cancer impact, that if you are using a long-term benzodiazepines, what are the risks or the mitigations on the particular cancers? And then there were several studies done. And we identified in 1 year that there was one researcher from the US, he filed a petition and he cited over 2 studies in that petition to ask FDA to revise the guideline for benzodiazepine because it flags some risk for particular cancers. So I think this is how it is going to impact. So yeah, it's really, I think, a good initiative. So we encourage everyone to join that. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sally Pearson from UNSW. I'm a local, and thanks so much. That was a really terrific session. I really like the thinking about the needs of the end users. In terms of generating the evidence, I think one of the things is these are highly complex analyses. The outputs aren't necessarily easy to navigate. So what's the thinking of Odyssey around making sure that the communications around the outputs are in fact accessible and can actually be used by the very people we're trying to serve?
This is actually a very good question. It is complicated. Even sometimes when I read papers, I'm like, oh, wait a second, how should I read that? And the complexity gets more, right? And this is something that we constantly talk about, and like, what does that mean? The dissemination of evidence is a much more important part. So we've been doing a lot of like, we write papers. Like papers do a little bit, like clinicians might feel more comfortable in reading the papers, right? But, or we create posters and some like materials, but there's also an understanding that like, this is not enough. Like how specifically if I, like for example, as a patient want to look and see like, what does that mean for me? That's still a little bit hard, but I think this is a journey for us. And this is something that as a community, we have to think and also get some feedback, so work together to build something that is translatable, that is easier to use for pickup for different stakeholders, right? So that might be a different case for the regulators. They're in this business of like looking with the evidence and scientific evidence. But it is a journey. And because we're actually looking at these complex systems and like a lot of different databases, like reading it, putting it into perspective becomes harder. We're learning how to do it better, how to collaborate, but I think there's still like a very, very long path in front of us, and we need to work together. I would really like to hear what you think.
Yeah, so Sally, I appreciate you raising that. I think as a broader research community, we're starting to get to terms with how we can generate evidence that we can trust. But then the next mile of that is how to take evidence that can be trusted and make sure it's in the hands of people so they can digest it and use it. And I would assert that we're collectively, as a broader research community, pretty bad at that.
Agreed.
And Mark and I actually have lots of friendly debates about this. To a certain extent, a primary mechanism of dissemination is the scholarly publication. And many of us are in academia, and that's our currency for the work that we do. And so it's not unreasonable that that's one mechanism. One thing we've tried to pioneer in the Odyssey community is this idea that if you're going to publish something, you should also create some interactive visualization dashboard so that someone can explore the results. So it's not just a static PDF document behind some paywall that nobody reads, but it actually can be something that can be truly accessible. That said, I think we haven't even started to scratch the surface of, it's one thing to make the evidence accessible, it's another thing to make it really actionably useful. And I think we need to expand the community to get stakeholders who can share the perspective of what do they need, how does it need to be presented, how do we communicate it more effectively. 100%. Absolutely. What, Anna, you want to say something?
That's actually a very fascinating topic. Yeah, so I felt an urge to also comment on that. I think one of the questions is, do we really know what type of information each stakeholder needs and in which format? And when we did, so research papers is one thing where we need to work on visualizations and also just informing people of the methods we use. Like if you look at the propensity score plots, we all the time need to tell people what those mean and how to interpret them, right? But then there is a separate area of other types of stakeholders, like, for example, individual clinicians. And when we did a data consult service experiment at Columbia University, where we generated evidence on demand and gave it to individual clinicians that needed it, we saw that they need different types of visualizations. They need scatter plots, like something that is really easy, something that is very intuitive. Otherwise, we're gonna spend days explaining what the methods are and how to interpret that. So I think we don't really have a good understanding of what each stakeholder needs, and maybe we need to think about that more.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Jason, yes.
My question is about your person. It's kind of a personal question. What are your motivation to get involved in Odyssey in the beginning, and what are your expectations in the near future, like 1 year later, and then a longer future, like 10 years for Odyssey? Both.
I'll go first. I'm happy to go first. I in my professional journey, I kind of inadvertently stumbled in this space of analyzing electronic health record data. And what I found really fascinating was I had many key decision makers in various organizations who were really left with needing evidence to make important decisions. I worked in multiple pharmaceutical companies where chief medical officers had to make decisions about whether or not to withdraw a product or not. And they needed information. And there was no evidence whatsoever for them to make a decision. And when they went down the hallway to their epidemiologist, they'd say, "That's a great question. I'll get back to you in 2 years." And I had specifically a chief medical officer at GlaxoSmithKline. I said, if I'm asking the question today, it's good as I need the evidence today because I got to make a decision today. And I think that it's, if we look at many, many other industries, the idea that large sets of data are available and that data can be analyzed and generate insights that can directly translate to decisions today is the expectation. And in many other fields, if we were in a situation where you said, wait a year till I publish my paper, you'd be laughed out of a room. And yet in healthcare, we accept the dearth of evidence that's available. And to me, that's completely unacceptable. I'm motivated very much by the drug safety problem, just as a specific use case, because I've lived with family members who've had adverse events for which they didn't know about it. They didn't know how often it happened. They didn't know whether it was caused by the product. And that causes bad behaviors in healthcare all around. And I'm sitting here looking at the world still doesn't have a pharmacovigilance system that takes advantage of data to actually tell us how often do adverse events happen, whether or not they are causally attributable to the exposure, and if it's going to happen to me as a personalized risk. Until that system exists, I'm going to keep fighting within the Odyssey community to make sure that that happens.
Thanks. Will you want to have a comment?
I have a very selfish goal too. So, I mean, last year when we did the Taiwan symposium, I think we had about 70 people in the room and maybe 10 or 20 people online because it was the first one after COVID. And I think we have 14 posters, right? This year we have over 100 people in this room. And we have doubled the amount of posters that we've gotten from last year. I remember the first year we did it, we had 11. Okay. So in 10 years, I want to see us 10 times as much in Odyssey APAC and be able to actually beat out, Asians are very, very competitive, okay? If you don't know that yet, we want to be able to beat out because we have the people. Okay, to beat out the global symposium, no offense, Patrick, okay, as well as the European symposium, no offense to Peter either. I know he's not here, but that's what I would like to see in Asia Pacific is for us as a community to be able to grow. And we've already expanded ourselves last year to India, and I hear rumors about Thailand and Vietnam and the Philippines. So we'd love to see in the next, 5 to 10 years, long-term wise, if shorter, that'd be even greater, better too. But to see us expand Odyssey and our collaborations across Asia Pacific. Of course, the global too, but so.
Okay. I have a different journey. And so I was an academic, and at some point I decided that I want to do more than writing papers and grants sitting alone in a room. I got out. During getting out, I got a job interview. Someone said Odyssey. I'm like, what is Odyssey? So I started digging them up. And then I become one of those epidemiologists down the hall who are getting answers and you got to give me a response immediately right now, but how, right? So I have to say I was very amazed by the complexity and what you can do at speed, and I started lurking around. At the same time, I was also very annoyed by the desire, the need that you need to give me this answer today, and there's no way that I can generate an answer today. So that's how I started, and because this thing actually happens quite a lot. I want to know the background rate of infection. That's in multiple myeloma, but what kind of patients, when, how do I do that? Usually we look into the literature, but the literature doesn't give you exactly what you have. So there is a lack, right? And that's pretty much a lot of motivation for me to help and collaborate pharmacovigilance and elsewhere. I do oncology. My training was in cancer epidemiology. So Patrick loves to do patient safety, and it's really great. I would really like to contribute to the oncology and what we're doing in that field. It's extremely complicated. It's never ending. It's going to stay complicated for another 10 years, but I'm hoping in 10 years as a community, we can actually address a lot of it. We can run studies, answer questions for the patients, regulators. People are using data already, and they're doing very irreproducible job. I think, and I'm hoping in 5 years we're sitting here and seeing the results being used in a better way and much more.
Awesome.